The lawyer slid the folder across the table, and I watched my husband's hand shake as he signed the last page. Marcus Hartley, 36 years old, an orthopedic surgeon who could reset a shattered femur without his pulse rising above 60, could not hold a pen steady while inheriting his father's lake house. "That's it," the lawyer said, capping his own pen like it was a small ceremony. "Alder Cove is yours." "Ours," I corrected silently, though I didn't say it out loud. I'd learned in 8 years of marriage that some corrections were better made in private. We drove north out of the city with our son Wesley asleep in his booster seat, his cheek smashed against the window, a stuffed raccoon named Sir Reginald tucked under his chin. 6 years old, and already he slept like his father, flat out, no apology, like the world could wait. Alder Cove sat on the eastern shore of Whisper Lake, 2 hours from Minneapolis, a property Marcus's father Walter had bought in 1994, back when lakefront land up there was still something a schoolteacher turned contractor could afford, if he was patient and a little bit stubborn. Walter had spent 30 years fixing that house up himself, replacing the dockboards one summer, reshingling the roof the next, and somewhere in those 3 decades it had stopped being an investment and become the place where the Hartley family measured its whole life. Christmases, graduations, the scattering of somebody's ashes off the end of the dock. I had been to Alder Cove exactly 4 times before Walter died. Every visit, I'd felt the particular chill of being tolerated rather than welcomed. Marcus never seemed to notice it. He loved his family with the uncomplicated, bottomless loyalty of a man who had spent his whole childhood being handed responsibility and never once resented it. Oldest son, the fixer, the one who drove 2 hours in a snowstorm because his mother's furnace made a funny noise. I loved that about him. I also, if I'm honest, feared it a little. Walter died in March, 11 months before we got the keys. A pancreatic cancer diagnosis that gave him 14 brutal weeks. At the funeral, his 3 daughters, Renata, Simone, and Ashley, sat in the front pew in a neat matching row of black. And I remember thinking they looked less like a family in mourning and more like a board of directors waiting for a merger announcement. The will was read 2 weeks later in a conference room that smelled like old coffee and fresh paper. Walter had left the bulk of his estate, Alder Cove, and a trust fund worth just over $1,100,000 to Marcus. His daughters received $40,000 each, and their mother, Diane Sr., everyone called her Big Diane to avoid confusing her with Renata's middle name, though nobody ever used it to her face, kept the family home in St. Paul and its contents. I watched Renata's face when the lawyer read the numbers. She didn't cry. She didn't gasp. She went very, very still, the way a lake goes still right before a storm rolls over the ridge. Dad said he trusted me to hold things together, Marcus told me that night, sitting on the edge of our bed with his tie still on, staring at nothing. That's what the letter said. He wrote me a letter. He said I was the one who'd keep everybody whole. What does that mean? I asked. Keep everybody whole? He shook his head. He didn't know. I don't think he wanted to know. Marcus had spent his whole life being the son who absorbed conflict so it wouldn't touch anyone else. And I think some quiet part of him already understood that his father had just handed him 11 months of conflict wrapped in a bow marked Lake House. I should have paid closer attention to that stillness on Renata's face. I didn't. I was busy being a wife, grieving a father-in-law I genuinely liked, and raising a 5-year-old who kept asking why Grandpa Walter wasn't answering his phone anymore. 11 months later, we turned the key in the lock at Alder Cove for the first time as its owners, and the sound it made, that solid, mechanical click, felt like the opening note of a song I didn't yet know the words to. Wesley woke when the car stopped, blinking up at the house through the windshield like he was trying to work out if it was real. "Is this a hotel?" he asked. "It's ours, buddy," Marcus said, and I heard something crack open in his voice, something that had been closed tight since the funeral. "This is home." We'd spent 4 months renovating before we moved in. New windows facing the water, the old dock rebuilt board by board by a contractor named Hollis who'd known Walter for 20 years and refused to charge us full price out of respect for him. I'd redone the kitchen myself, in the sense that I'd drawn every layout on graph paper at our kitchen table in the city, 3 years of freelance floral design money going into quartz countertops and a farmhouse sink I'd wanted since I was 19 years old, working weddings for other people's dream houses. It wasn't excessive, I want to be clear about that, because later, people would try to make it sound like we'd built ourselves a palace on the backs of grieving women. It was a 4-bedroom lake house with good bones and better light. It was the first home either of us had ever owned outright. Marcus had done 6 years of residency living on ramen and hospital coffee. I had built a flower business out of a garage. We were not people who'd had things handed to us, except, of course, for the one enormous thing that had, in fact, been handed to us, which was the whole complicated point. Wesley ran straight for the water. 6 years old, shoes still on, and Marcus laughed, a real laugh, the kind I hadn't heard from him in almost a year, and chased him down to the dock, both of them shrieking when the cold spray came up over the boards. I stood in the kitchen with my hand flat on the cool quartz and let myself believe, for exactly one afternoon, that we had earned a stretch of uncomplicated happiness. The peace lasted 6 days. They didn't call ahead. That should have told me something, but I was still new enough to the Hartley family rhythms to read it as enthusiasm instead of entitlement. Renata arrived first, in a white SUV that cost more than my first car. Her 13-year-old son Jax slouched in the passenger seat with earbuds in. Renata ran a boutique real estate agency that specialized in luxury lakeside properties, which meant that from the moment she stepped out of the car, she was not visiting her brother's house. She was appraising it. "Marcus," she took his face in both hands, the way you'd inspect a horse's teeth. "Look at you. The country air agrees with you. Or maybe it's just not sharing 400 square feet with your wife's fabric swatches anymore." "Hi, Renata," I said. "Glad you could make it." She looked at me the way you'd look at a piece of furniture that had come with the house. "Bronwyn, sorry, Josephine, I always do that." "My name is Josephine." She had never once in 8 years called me by the wrong name in front of Marcus's colleagues or her own friends. Only ever with me. Simone came next, drifting in on a cloud of essential oils, calling herself a somatic wellness guide now, which was new. 6 months ago, she'd been a life alignment coach, and 18 months before that, an aspiring interior stylist with $40,000 of debt and no portfolio. She hugged Marcus for 11 full seconds, eyes closed, humming faintly, and then opened her eyes and looked past me at the house. "The energy in here," she breathed. "It's so expansive. And so expensive." She laughed her tinkling laugh, the one with no warmth underneath it. "You've been holding out on us, little brother." Ashley arrived last, 20 minutes behind her sisters, mascara already smudged from crying in the car, though about what, I never learned. She was 29, newly divorced, and had a talent for walking into any room and making herself its emotional center of gravity within 4 minutes flat. She threw her arms around Marcus's neck and held on a beat too long. "I've missed you," she said into his shoulder. "You were always the one who took care of me. Remember the peanut butter and fluff sandwiches when Mom was working doubles?" "I remember," Marcus said and squeezed her shoulder, and I watched the old reflex switch on behind his eyes, the pediatrician's reflex, the fixer's reflex, the thing that made him brilliant with frightened children and blind to grown women who used the same tools on him. "I live 20 minutes away, Ash," he said gently. "It's not the same," she said, "and you know it." The afternoon that followed was a masterclass in a particular kind of cruelty, the kind that never raises its voice, never says an insultable sentence out loud, and leaves you standing in your own kitchen wondering if you're crazy for feeling attacked. Renata opened her own cheap bottle of wine over the top of the good bottle I'd chilled, informing me that my Sancerre was a bit much for a casual Sunday. Simone ran a finger along my quartz island and asked, "Granite? Or did you go with something more practical?" in a tone that made practical sound like an insult. Ashley told a long story about her ex-husband's financial betrayals, with her hand resting on Marcus's forearm the entire time, her voice trembling in a way that made him lean in, made him forget I was standing 4 feet away holding a serving spoon. Wesley, thrilled to have cousins and aunts filling up his new house, kept trying to show Jax his new Lego set. Jax, 13 and glued to his phone, told him it was a baby toy and went back to scrolling. I told myself, they're grieving, they're adjusting. This is what a complicated family looks like from the inside. I was wrong about the timeline. It wasn't grief. It had started long before Walter died, and it would not end until it had taken almost everything from us, except, in the end, the one thing they actually wanted. That night, after we'd put Wesley to bed, subdued, confused about why Jax hadn't wanted to play with him, I found Marcus on the dock, staring at the black water. "You okay?" I asked, handing him a beer. "Just tired. It's a lot having everyone here at once." "They're a lot," I said. "They mean well." The family mantra, delivered on reflex, the way some people say bless you after a sneeze. Dad's death hit them hard. It changed things. The thing neither of us said out loud sat between us like a fourth person on that dock. The inheritance. Walter's letter. "I trust you to hold things together." "They think you manipulated him," I said quietly. It wasn't a question. Simone had all but said it at the funeral, through artfully arranged tears. He was so confused at the end. "I know they do." Marcus's voice was thick. "But I didn't, Joe. You know I didn't. I would have split it evenly if it had been up to me. Dad knew that." "Then why didn't he?" Marcus was quiet for a long time. He said I was the one who'd hold it together. For everyone. I looked out at the lake, its black surface holding a perfect mirror of the stars, until a fish broke it somewhere near the reeds, a small ripple spreading out from something moving underneath the calm. "We are a family," I said, turning to face him, cupping his tired face in my hands. "You, me, and Wes. That's the family we protect." He kissed me, slow and grateful, and told me he loved me, and thanked me for the day, for everything. I held him and said nothing about the chill that had settled into my spine an hour earlier, at dinner, when Renata had dabbed her mouth with a napkin and said, apropos of nothing, "The practice must be paying well to afford all this." A gesture that took in the house, the lake, the whole shape of our new life. "Property taxes on the water are brutal, you know. Dad always said lakefront was a luxury that bled you dry." "We've budgeted for it," Marcus had said. "It's under control." "Of course it is," Simone had murmured. "You've always been the responsible one, the stable one." A small, humorless laugh. "It's almost like you've stepped into Dad's role, the patriarch, with the assets to match." The word had hung there, in the steam rising off the pasta, and none of us had reached for it, and none of us had let it go either. Later, lying awake while Marcus slept, I thought about Renata's hand closing around my wine bottle without asking. I thought about Simone's finger tracing my countertop like she was calculating square footage. I thought about Ashley's hand on my husband's arm and the practiced tremble in her voice. What, I wondered, Did Walter think was going to come apart, that he needed his son to hold it together? I didn't know yet. I would find out in exactly 10 months, in the ugliest way possible, in front of 22 guests on the 4th of July. We hosted Thanksgiving that year because Diane Sr., Big Diane, had one of her migraines, according to Renata, who informed me of this arrangement 2 days before the holiday in a tone that left no room for negotiation. "We're not going to make her host 20 people with a migraine," Renata said over the phone, as though I'd suggested it. "Your place is big enough. It's settled." It wasn't a request. It had never been a request. I looked at Marcus across the kitchen, phone pressed to my ear, and he gave me a small, apologetic shrug that I would come to recognize as his signature move. The shrug that meant, "I know this isn't fair, and I'm going to let it happen anyway, because saying no to my sisters costs more than I know how to pay." So on Thursday morning, they arrived in a parade of expectation. Simone brought a store-bought pecan pie, still in its plastic clamshell, and told me the abundance just flows from me, as if I'd conjured the 17-pound turkey and the 4 side dishes out of pure vibration. Ashley brought a 2-liter bottle of neon fruit soda for the kids. Renata brought 2 bottles of the same cheap Pinot Noir she always brought, on what I now understood was some kind of standing 3 for $12 deal at a grocery store 40 minutes from my house. Jax, now 14, arrived glued to a different phone but with the same posture. My son, 6 now, had spent a full week building a Lego space station, nearly 200 pieces, painstakingly following a manual meant for kids twice his age, and he dragged it into the living room to show his older cousin with the kind of hope only 6-year-olds are brave enough to still carry. "Look what I made," Wesley said. Jax glanced over without lifting his chin off his fist. "The wings are wrong for atmospheric entry." "He's into astrophysics," Renata announced to the room, pouring herself a generous glass of the cheap wine, and that was the end of anyone acknowledging what Wesley had built. Dinner itself was a strained pantomime. Marcus carved the turkey, his father's old job, a detail that made his jaw work the entire time he did it, and raised his glass to family. "To family who step up," Renata amended, clinking her glass against his with a precision that felt less like a toast and more like a verdict. Halfway through the meal, a crash came from the living room. We found Wesley standing in the wreckage of 200 careful hours, tears streaming, pointing a shaking finger at Jax, who was slouched on the couch with his phone still in his hand. "He kicked it," Wesley said. "He said it was stupid, and he kicked it." "It was an accident," Jack said, not looking up. "I stretched my leg. He left it in the way." "Apologize to your cousin," Marcus said, the first note of real authority I'd ever heard him take with the boy. "Sorry," Jax muttered to his screen. "Boys will be boys," Renata said, waving a hand. "Don't be so sensitive, Wesley. They're just toys." I watched my husband, a man who spliced tendons back together for a living, whose hands were steady enough to trust with a child's spine, get down on the floor and start picking up 200 tiny plastic pieces, trying to rebuild what his nephew had destroyed, while his sister sipped grocery store wine and told our son not to be sensitive. Something in me went very quiet and very cold that afternoon. I didn't know yet that it was the opening scene of a much longer story. I thought it was just a bad holiday. I thought, the way you do when you love someone whose family is difficult, that this was simply the price of admission. I was wrong. It wasn't the price. It was the preview. Between that Thanksgiving and the following summer, the sisters found dozens of small ways to remind us who they thought we were and who they thought we owed. Renata began helping by sending us listings for lakefront properties in worse locations, just in case you two ever want to downsize to something more manageable. a phrase she used so often I started keeping a tally. Simone offered, unprompted, to run a clearing ceremony on the house, insisting that Walter's spirit was unsettled by how we'd rearranged the furniture in the den, the same den where he used to fall asleep in his recliner watching baseball. I told her, as gently as I could, that we'd pass. She told Marcus, later, that I was closed off to the family's healing process, which was news to me since I hadn't realized grief now came with a scheduled itinerary. Ashley called Marcus late at night at least twice a month, always in tears, always about money, rent, her car, a temporary cash flow problem that was somehow never actually temporary. I watched him transfer $400 here, $600 there, always followed by the same text: "Don't tell Jo, she'll worry." I found out about most of it eventually, not because he confessed, but because I did our taxes. Big Diane called every Sunday, and every Sunday, some portion of the conversation circled back gently, insistently, to the house. It must be so much keeping up a place like that. Your father worked himself to the bone for that property, you know. It would break my heart if it ever left the family. As if we were tenants. As if Marcus's name on the deed was a technicality rather than a fact. I brought it up to Marcus in March, almost exactly a year after we'd gotten the keys. "I feel like we're being slowly billed for a house we already paid for," I said. "They just don't have what we have," he said. "It's not their fault they act out." "It doesn't have to be their fault for it to be a problem, Marcus." He didn't have an answer for that. He rarely did, when I said things like it out loud instead of letting them dissolve into the general fog of family is complicated. I loved my husband with my whole chest, but I had begun to understand that his greatest strength, his bottomless, unconditional compassion, was also the exact place where 3 grown women had learned over 30 years exactly where to press. I didn't know yet how hard they were capable of pressing. I found out on the 4th of July, in front of 22 guests, when my son asked for a second helping of ribs at his own family's cookout. We'd invited 22 people, neighbors from down the shore, Marcus's colleagues from the practice, my old friends from the floral co-op, 3 of them driving up with their kids for the weekend, and, because Marcus could not imagine a major holiday without them, his mother and all 3 of his sisters, plus Jax, plus Ashley's new boyfriend Derek, a man who introduced himself by immediately asking what our house had appraised for. It was, on paper, a beautiful day. 94 degrees, not a cloud in the sky, the lake so still in the morning it looked poured rather than settled. I'd spent 3 days prepping. A whole table of sides, a cooler of drinks, a tray of the maple chipotle ribs I'd been perfecting since spring, the recipe that would, months later, and for reasons I could not have predicted, change the entire shape of my life. Wesley had been looking forward to this party for 2 weeks. He'd made a sign for the dock that said "Happy 4th" in glitter glue, and he'd been up since 7, helping me carry napkins outside, buzzing with the specific electricity of a 6-year-old who has been promised sparklers after dark. By 4 in the afternoon, the party was in full swing. Marcus manned the big stainless steel grill his father had left behind, flipping ribs and corn, laughing with Dr. Okafor from his practice about a fishing trip. Kids ran shrieking through sprinklers on the lawn. I was setting out the dessert table, a sheet cake, a bowl of berries, a plate of cookies, when Wesley came trotting up, sun-flushed and starving, and reached for a rib off the resting platter I'd set aside for the family to eat first, before the guests were called to the buffet line. A hand closed around his wrist, Renata's hand, hard enough that Wesley froze mid-reach, his mouth already open in surprise. "Whoa there, little man." Her voice was a sing-song that didn't match the grip. "We don't just grab, especially not from the good platter. That one's for the grown-ups who actually cooked something today." "I helped Mom make them," Wesley said in a small voice. "Did you?" Renata said. and I watched something in her face shift. Something that had been building, I would later understand, for 11 months. Ever since a lawyer's conference room and a will that hadn't gone the way she'd expected. You know, some kids ask nicely for what they get given. Other kids just take and take and take, and never think about who's actually paying for any of it. She let go of his wrist, gave him a light, humiliating pat on the head, the kind you'd give a dog that had misbehaved. Don't be such a little beggar, Wesley. Some of us actually earn what we eat around here. The yard didn't go silent, exactly. The party kept moving around us, someone's radio playing, kids splashing, ice clinking in a cooler somewhere. But the 6 or 7 people close enough to hear went very, very quiet. And I watched my son's face do the thing that no mother should ever have to watch her child's face do. I watched him understand, all at once, that he had been humiliated on purpose, in public, by a grown woman who was supposed to love him. He didn't cry right away. He just stood there, 7 years old in 3 weeks, holding his empty hand where the rib had almost been, his cheeks going a deep, mortified red. I don't remember crossing the lawn. I remember the sting in my palm before I understood what I'd done. And I remember Renata's hand flying up to her cheek, her eyes going wide with a shock that even in that moment, some cold part of my brain registered as performance. "You do not," I said, and my voice came out lower and steadier than I felt. "Ever speak to my son like that again." "She hit me," Renata said, to no one, to everyone, already turning to find an audience. "Did everyone see that? She hit me!" And that was when Marcus, standing 8 feet away at the grill with a pair of tongs still in his hand, went very still, the stillness of a man doing quiet, terrible math. And then set the tongs down on the cutting board with a click, walked to the grill, gripped both sides of it with his bare hands, and flipped the entire thing over. The grill hit the deck with a metallic crash loud enough that I felt it in my teeth. Hot coals, ribs, corn cobs, and grease scattered across the boards. A tongue of flame licked up from the spilled charcoal before someone, Dr. Okafor, I think, grabbed the fire extinguisher off its hook by the back door and smothered it in a hiss of white foam. For 1 full second, the entire party simply froze. 22 people, and not one sound except the hiss of the extinguisher and the lake lapping against the dock, indifferent to all of it. Then Ashley screamed. Simone had her phone up and recording before the coals had even stopped rolling, the little red light glowing steady in her hand. Jack stood with a rib still in his mouth, eyes huge. Wesley pressed himself against my leg, shaking. Marcus stood in the middle of the wreckage, chest heaving, both hands still curled into fists at his sides, grease and soot streaked up one forearm. "Get out," he said. His voice wasn't loud. It was worse than loud. It was flat and shaking and absolutely certain. "All of you, get out of my house." "Caleb, Marcus," Simone stammered, phone still trained on him. "How could you? After everything we—" "My son is not a beggar," Marcus said, and his voice cracked clean down the middle on the word son. "He is 7 years old in 3 weeks. He is a little boy in his own backyard, at his own family's party, and you—" He turned to Renata, and I watched 36 years of swallowed history come up all at once, in front of 24 witnesses. "You do not get to speak to him like that. You do not get to touch him like that. Not ever again." "She assaulted me," Renata said, tears springing up on command, one hand pressed dramatically to a cheek that had, I'll admit, gone slightly pink. "Everyone saw it. She just hid me for no reason. I saw you humiliate a 7-year-old for taking a rib at his own party, Marcus said. I saw exactly what you did. For the first time in my whole life, I actually saw you. The rest of the afternoon dissolved into a chaos of gathered purses and hissed accusations. Ashley wept loudly on Marcus's shoulder. How can you do this to us? We're your sisters! Until he physically, gently, removed her arms from around his neck. Simone kept her phone raised the entire time, narrating under her breath for whatever audience she imagined watching later. Look at this. Look at what happens when you try to bring the family together. Bernarda paused at the gate on her way out, her cheek not even properly red anymore, and leaned in close enough that only I could hear her. You have no idea, she said quietly, what you just started. At the time, I read it as a threat born of embarrassment, the kind of thing wounded pride says on its way out the door. I would spend the next 4 months learning exactly how literal she'd meant it. By 9 that night, most of the guests had gone home early, murmuring awkward goodbyes, unsure what they'd just witnessed or how to feel about it. Wesley cried himself to sleep in my arms an hour after the sparklers he'd been so excited about sat forgotten in their box on the counter. Marcus spent 2 hours on the deck, shoveling cold, greasy wreckage into trash bags in the dark, not speaking, his shoulders bent in a way I'd never seen on him before, not even at his father's funeral. I shouldn't have done that, he said, when I finally came out to find him. The grill. I could have started a real fire. I lost control completely. You protected your son, I said. That's not the same as losing control. Is it? He looked at his hands, streaked black with soot. My God, Joe, I don't think I've been that angry in my entire life. His phone, sitting on the patio table, lit up for the 4th time in 10 minutes. Mom. He stared at it the way you'd stare at a snake that had gotten into the house, and then, with a shuddering breath, he picked it up. I could hear his mother's voice, tinny and frantic, even from where I stood. I watched my husband's face go pale and paler over the course of a 4-minute phone call, and when he finally hung up, he set the phone down like it weighed 40 pounds. She wants us to apologize, he said flat. She says Renata is devastated, that I chose my wife over my own blood, that Dad would be heartbroken to see what I've become. I took his soot-blackened hands in mine. Marcus, look at me. We have nothing to apologize for. She hurt our son on purpose, in front of an audience, to punish you for a will you didn't write. An apology tells her it worked. It tells her she can do it again. But the family. What family? I asked softly, gesturing at the ruined deck, the overturned grill, the smell of burnt meat and propane hanging over everything we'd built. The one that grabs a little boy's wrist and calls him a beggar for wanting a rib at his own party? Is that the family you're so afraid of losing? He didn't have an answer. He just pulled me into a hard, desperate hug and held on, his face buried in my hair, while somewhere behind us, in the dark house, our son slept the exhausted sleep of a child who had learned, at 6 years old, that love could come with conditions attached. I thought that was the worst of it. I genuinely believed, standing on that ruined deck, that we had reached the bottom. I had no idea we hadn't even started falling yet. My phone lit up at 11:40 that night, then again, a rapid, ugly cascade of text notifications and email alerts that pulled me up out of a shallow, restless sleep with a cold certainty settling into my stomach before I'd even reached for the screen. It was a group text. I counted later, 41 recipients, including extended family I'd met maybe twice, old family friends, two of Marcus's colleagues from the practice, and, inexplicably, my own mother-in-law's book club leader. The message was from Renata, and it was long, and it was very, very good. That was the thing that frightened me most, reading it. How good it was, how carefully built, like she'd been drafting it in her head for months and had simply been waiting for an excuse. It described an unprovoked, violent assault at what should have been a joyful family holiday. It detailed Marcus's dangerous rampage, his destruction of property, his endangerment of children present, including his own son. It painted Renata and her sisters as heartbroken women who had only ever tried to bring the family together, now afraid for their safety. It expressed deep, syrupy concern for that sweet boy growing up in such a volatile household. It closed with, "We are praying for Marcus and his family during this difficult time. Mental health issues affect so many of us. All we want, as always, is healing." Attached was Simone's video. I watched it, standing in the dark of our bedroom, the blue light washing over my face, my hands not quite steady. It started 3 seconds after I'd already slapped Renata, conveniently, invisibly cropping out the 11 months of small cruelties. The wrist grab, the word beggar, the humiliation of a 6-year-old in front of 24 guests. It showed me standing there, jaw tight, clearly the aggressor. It showed Renata's hand flying to her cheek, and then it showed Marcus, my gentle, careful husband, a man who had never in 8 years raised his voice at me, turning into what looked, on an 11-second clip with no context, exactly like a man having a violent breakdown, flipping a flaming grill in front of children. It had been trimmed to 1 minute and 6 seconds. It had been posted, I would learn within days, not just to that group text, but to a semi-private Facebook group for our lake community, 380 members, mostly homeowners on Whisper Lake, the same people whose kids went to Wesley's summer camp, the same people we waved to on morning walks. The caption under the video read, "A reminder that even beautiful houses can hide ugly things, praying for peace for everyone involved, especially the children." She never used our names in the public post. She didn't have to. Everyone in a 380-person lake community group knew exactly whose new lake house that grill belonged to. I didn't wake Marcus. I lay there for a long time, watching the shadows shift on the ceiling, the phone clutched in my hand like a small, cold stone. And I understood, really understood, for the first time, that what had happened on our deck that afternoon wasn't the end of anything. It was a declaration. And the battlefield wasn't our backyard anymore. It was our name, our reputation, and the story of who we were being written in real time by someone who had spent 36 years learning exactly which threads to pull. The next 72 hours were, without question, the worst of my life up to that point. And I include in that comparison the 11 hours of labor it had taken to bring Wesley into the world. By Friday morning, the video had 412 views in the lake group and had been shared privately at least a dozen more times that I knew of. Marcus's cousin Deb, whom we hadn't heard from in 3 years, texted, "Saw the video. Is everything okay over there? Family is everything. Don't let a moment of anger destroy yours." An aunt on his father's side sent a long, concerned message about getting help for whatever's going on in that house. A colleague from the practice, not one who'd been there, someone who'd only seen the clip forwarded from someone else, left Marcus a voicemail suggesting, gently, that he take some time before his next shift. A few real friends called directly. "Dude, what actually happened? That can't be the whole story." But for every one of those calls, there were 4 silences. People who simply stopped texting, stopped inviting Wesley to playdates, stopped waving at the grocery store. Marcus spent those 3 days in a kind of fog, cycling between shame and fury so fast it was giving him headaches. I shouldn't have flipped the grill. I gave them exactly what they wanted. I looked unhinged. And then, 20 minutes later, watching Wesley flinch at a raised voice on a cartoon. But how dare she?
How dare she touch him like that?
The formal pressure campaign began Friday afternoon, and it was, I'll give her this, expertly designed. It wasn't a frontal assault. Renata had spent 36 years studying her brother's exact psychology, and she knew precisely which lever to pull. His bottomless, exhausting need for family harmony. Ashley called first, her voice a throaty, tear-soaked whisper. Marcus, please, this is tearing me apart. Can't we just talk as a family before this goes any further? Then Simone, framing it in the softened language of her trade. I think we're all just dysregulated right now. What if we did a restorative circle, a guided conversation with a mediator I know, just to process what happened, so we can move forward as a family? Then Big Diane herself, calling from a blocked number, her voice frail in a way that made something in Marcus's chest visibly cave in, even from across the kitchen. Your sisters are devastated, Marcus. Renata's struggling. You know the business hasn't been easy this year. This is tearing our family apart, and your father would be heartbroken. I watched my husband absorb call after call like body blows, each one landing exactly where 36 years of practice had taught them to aim. They want an apology, he told me Saturday night, sitting at the kitchen table with his head in his hands. A joint statement, something we can all post, saying it was a misunderstanding that got out of hand on both sides. On both sides, I repeated. I know how it sounds. Marcus, she called our son a beggar and grabbed his wrist hard enough to leave a mark. There is no both sides. There is a woman who hurt a child on purpose, and there is us. He didn't argue, but he didn't sleep either. And by Sunday morning, I understood that if I didn't do something, the sheer gravitational weight of 36 years of family pressure was going to pull him under, one apologetic phone call at a time, until we were the ones publicly performing contrition for a crime we hadn't committed. So on Sunday afternoon, while Marcus took Wesley fishing off the dock, the first hour of peace either of them had gotten all week, I sat down at the kitchen table with my laptop, and I started building the thing that would end up saving us. I started keeping a record. I am, by training, a florist and a graphic designer, not an investigator. But 8 years of running a small business had taught me one useful thing. Paper trails don't lie, even when people do. I started with the video itself. I found the original post in the Lake community group before Simone quietly deleted it Sunday night. Too late, I'd already screen recorded the whole thing, comments and all, along with timestamps and the exact account that had posted it. I found the original group text, saved every message, every reply. Then I did something that felt petty at the time and would turn out to be the single most important thing I did that whole summer. I texted 3 of the guests who'd actually been standing close enough to hear what Renata said to Wesley before the slap. Dr. Okafor, who'd grabbed the fire extinguisher, our neighbor Priya from 2 docks down, and my old friend Cass, up visiting from the co-op. All 3, independently, without me feeding them any details, described the same sequence. Renata grabbing Wesley's wrist, the word beggar, the humiliating pat on the head, and then, only then, the slap. Cass, unprompted, said she'd actually started recording on her own phone about 10 seconds after Simone had, catching Renata's tail end still audible. Some of us actually earn what we eat. I asked Cass to send me that clip. She did, within the hour. 31 seconds of raw, unedited footage that included both the insult and the flip of the grill in full, unbroken context. It changed everything about the shape of the video Simone had circulated. Where her edit made me look like an unprovoked aggressor and Marcus look like a man having a breakdown, Cass's footage, messier, shakier, real, showed exactly what had actually happened, in the order it had actually happened, with no cuts. I didn't post it anywhere, not yet. I just kept it. Filed it alongside screenshots of the group text, alongside a growing folder labeled, with a bluntness I found strangely calming, evidence. Marcus found me at the kitchen table close to midnight, laptop open, 3 tabs of documentation staring back at me. "What is all this?" he asked. "Insurance," I said. "I'm not doing anything with it. I just don't want us walking into whatever comes next unarmed, the way we walked into the last 11 months unarmed." He sat down across from me and read through it, slowly. And I watched something shift in his face. Not anger exactly, something quieter and more permanent. Recognition, maybe. The particular vertigo of realizing that a pattern you'd spent your whole life calling family being family actually had a shape and a history, and very possibly an intention behind it. "There's something else," he said, after a long silence. "Ashley called me again tonight, while you were putting Wes to bed." "And?" "She let something slip, about Renata, about the business." He rubbed his eyes. "Joe, I think Renata's in real trouble, financially. I think that might be part of why she's been the way she's been, all year." I sat back. "What kind of trouble?" "I don't know exactly. Ashley said something about the agency, about Renata borrowing against the house. Her actual house, not ours." He shook his head. "I don't know if it's true. Ashley exaggerates when she wants sympathy." I didn't say what I was thinking, which was, maybe it's true. And maybe that's exactly why the will hit her so hard. And maybe that's exactly why a woman who owns 3 investment properties needed, badly, publicly, to turn her brother into the villain of this story before anyone started asking why she needed money in the first place. I didn't say it because I didn't have proof yet. But I filed it away, next to the video, next to the screenshots, in the growing folder that I was starting to understand might become a great deal more than insurance. 2 weeks later, I found out exactly how much more. It was a Tuesday in late July when a stranger in a gray polo shirt knocked on our front door holding a clipboard. "Mrs. Hartley, I'm with Hennepin County Child Protective Services. We received a report and need to ask you and your husband a few questions." I felt the floor tilt under me. Wesley was at his summer camp, thank God, off swimming somewhere blissfully unaware, and Marcus was at the practice, and I stood in the doorway of the home we'd built with our own hands and our own money, holding a dish towel, staring at a stranger who had come to investigate whether we were safe to raise our own son. "A report," I repeated. "About what?" He consulted his clipboard, his tone carefully neutral, in the way I imagine they're trained for. "The complaint alleges a pattern of instability in the home, verbal and physical altercations witnessed by the child, concerns about the emotional environment. There's a video attached to the file." I let him in. I answered every question with a steadiness that surprised even me. And when he asked whether he could speak with Wesley when he got home from camp, I said yes, of course, anything you need, and meant it, because I understood in that moment, standing in my kitchen with a county caseworker taking notes, that the worst thing I could possibly do was act like I had something to hide. I also understood, with a clarity that turned my blood to ice water, exactly who had filed that complaint and exactly what she'd used as evidence. Marcus came home to find me sitting at the table, the folder open in front of me, and I watched 8 years of marriage flash across his face in about 4 seconds. Disbelief, then horror, then something I'd genuinely never seen on him before. Not sadness, not his usual instinct to smooth things over. Something colder. "She reported us," he said. It wasn't a question. "We don't know that for certain." "Joe." His voice was very quiet. "Who else would it be?" I didn't have an answer for that either. I had a folder full of evidence and a caseworker's card on the counter and a 6-year-old due home from camp in 90 minutes who had no idea his family had just become the subject of a government investigation because his aunt had decided that losing an inheritance battle was worth burning her own nephew to win. The caseworker's name was Tanya Reyes, and to her enormous credit, she treated the entire process with a careful, unhurried professionalism that neither confirmed our fears nor dismissed them. She spoke with Wesley alone, in his own room, with his stuffed raccoon on his lap, for 20 minutes, while Marcus and I sat in the kitchen, not breathing properly. She came down afterward with a face that told me nothing. "He's a well-adjusted, articulate little boy," she said finally. He described a happy home. He also described, unprompted, a party where his aunt grabbed his wrist and called him a name that upset him, and he described his dad getting really mad afterward. But he was very clear that his dad has never yelled at him or hurt him, ever. He drew me a picture of the two of you. She set a folded piece of paper on the counter, and I unfolded it later, after she'd gone, to find 3 stick figures holding hands in front of a blue triangle of a lake, the sun rendered as a lopsided yellow scribble in the corner, and the words, "My family," written underneath in careful, backward-leaning 6-year-old letters. I cried for the first time since the whole thing began, standing alone in my kitchen holding that drawing. The investigation took 11 days. 11 days of a strange, suspended existence, where I found myself narrating our own ordinary life to an imaginary jury. "See, this is what a normal breakfast looks like. See, this is what it looks like when nobody in this house is afraid of anybody else," while trying to shield Wesley from understanding that anything unusual was happening at all. Tanya called on a Thursday afternoon to close the file. "The complaint doesn't meet our threshold for further action," she said. "I want to be straightforward with you, Mrs. Hartley. Reports like this, filed by an estranged family member with what looks like significant personal motive, aren't uncommon, and it's part of why we investigate thoroughly instead of taking any single account at face value. Your son is safe. Your file is closed." I thanked her, hung up, and sat down hard on the kitchen floor, my back against the cabinets, and let myself shake for a full 5 minutes before I trusted my legs to hold me again. That night, once Wesley was asleep, Marcus and I sat at the table with the evidence folder open between us, and for the first time, I watched my husband stop trying to find the version of events where his sister was simply misguided or grieving or acting out of love gone sideways. "She used our son," he said slowly, "as a weapon in a fight about money." "Yes. She filed a false report with the state, hoping it would either take him away from us or scare us badly enough that we'd hand over, what? Money? The house?" His hands, resting flat on the table, had gone white-knuckled. "What does she actually want, Joe?" I thought about Ashley's slip a few weeks earlier, Renata borrowing against the house, real financial trouble. And I thought about a woman who ran a luxury lakeside real estate agency, but drove a leased SUV and brought $40 wine to every family gathering like clockwork. "I think," I said carefully, We need to actually find out. It was Ashley, in the end, who cracked the whole thing open, not out of loyalty to us and not out of guilt, though I think a real uncomfortable amount of guilt was part of it. It was because 3 weeks after the CPS report closed, Ashley discovered that Renata had used her name without permission as a co-signer on a business loan 2 years earlier. A loan that was now 4 months delinquent and about to go to collections, dragging Ashley's already fragile credit down with it. She showed up at our door on a Sunday morning without calling first, mascara streaked in exactly the way I'd come to recognize as her natural resting state, and asked if she could talk to me. Not Marcus, me. We sat on the back deck, the new grill, smaller and sturdier, sitting cold and unused a few feet away, and she told me everything, in the disorganized, overlapping way of someone who has been carrying a secret so long it comes out in the wrong order. Renata's agency had been hemorrhaging money for almost 2 years. A bad commercial investment in a strip mall renovation that never leased up. A second mortgage on her own house that she'd taken out to cover payroll. And 6 months before Walter died, a private loan from their father, $45,000, off the books, meant to be quietly repaid, that Renata had never told anyone about and had absolutely never repaid. She thought Dad was going to leave her the lake house, Ashley said, twisting a napkin in her hands. She'd been telling people that for years. She has clients, Joe. Rich clients, the kind she needs to keep believing she's successful. She told half of them she was renovating a family lake property for a listing she was going to debut. When the will named Marcus instead, I don't even know how to describe what happened to her. She didn't just lose an inheritance. She lost the story she'd been telling everyone about who she was. And the CPS report? Ashley's face crumpled. She said if she could prove Marcus was unstable, unfit somehow, there might be grounds to challenge the will, undue influence, or… I don't fully understand the legal part. She talked to a lawyer. She's been talking to a lawyer for months, Joe, since before Thanksgiving. She's trying to get the will thrown out. The pieces I'd been half-assembling for weeks clicked into a single, ugly shape all at once. The $40,000 Pinot Noir woman who couldn't stop appraising our kitchen, the relentless comments about assets and property taxes, the 11 months of small, deliberate provocations building toward what exactly? A breakdown she could film? An overreaction she could weaponize? A pattern of instability a lawyer could point to in a courtroom? She hadn't grabbed Wesley's wrist because she was thoughtless. She'd done it because she needed a reaction, and she'd gotten a better one than she could have planned for. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked Ashley. She looked out at the lake for a long moment. "Because she used my name on a loan I never agreed to, and now it's my credit in the toilet, and because…" Her voice cracked. "Because I watched her grab that little boy's wrist, Joe, and I didn't say anything. And I've been sick about it for 3 weeks, and I just needed someone to know I know." It wasn't absolution. I didn't offer her any. But it was, I would come to understand, the first loose thread in a rope that was about to come completely undone. We hired an estate attorney named Priyanka Shah, recommended by Dr. Okafor, who specialized in exactly this particular flavor of family disaster. Will contests dressed up as concern, financial desperation dressed up as grief. She listened to the whole story in her office over the course of 90 minutes, taking notes on a yellow legal pad. And when I finished, she set her pen down and looked at both of us with an expression that was somehow both sympathetic and entirely businesslike. "I want to be honest with you," she said. "Contesting a will on grounds of undue influence is difficult, and it's more difficult still when the deceased left a clear, signed letter explaining his reasoning. Your father-in-law's letter to Marcus explaining that he trusted him to hold things together. That's actually strong evidence against a claim of manipulation. It shows intent, and it shows he was of sound mind enough to explain himself. So we're not in danger of losing the house, Marcus said. Legally, no. I think a challenge to the will would fail, and I think, frankly, that any competent attorney would tell your sister the same thing. She tapped her pen against the pad, which raises an interesting question. If she knows, or her lawyer has told her, that a will contest is unlikely to succeed, then the CPS report and the video and the smear campaign in your lake community start to look less like steps toward a legal outcome and more like something else. Like what? I asked. Pressure, Priyanka said simply. Sometimes people who know they can't win in court try to win in public opinion instead, hoping the family will crack under social pressure and offer some kind of settlement just to make the humiliation stop. Money to go away. A quiet buyout of the house at a below-market price, dressed up as keeping it in the family. I've seen it before. It's uglier than a lawsuit, and it's harder to fight, because there's no judge to rule on a Facebook post. She was quiet for a moment, studying us. Do you want to fight it, or do you want to end it? Marcus looked at me. I could see him doing the math he'd been avoiding for 11 months. The cost, not in money, but in every future holiday, every phone call, every version of family he'd need to grieve in order to protect the one that actually mattered. I want to end it, he said. All of it. Priyanka nodded like she'd expected that answer and had already been building toward it. Then here's what we're going to do. Over the following 6 weeks, what had started as a folder of screenshots on my laptop became, under Priyanka's guidance, something closer to an actual legal file. We submitted Cass's unedited video, the full 31 seconds, showing the wrist grab, the insult, and the context Simone's edit had so carefully cut away, to Hennepin County's records, formally as part of a request to have the CPS complaint noted as unsubstantiated and, per Priyanka's advice, to flag the filer for a pattern that a future report might need to weigh. It wasn't a criminal case. False reports, infuriatingly, are hard to prosecute unless you can prove deliberate intent beyond a reasonable doubt. But it went on record. It existed now, permanently, as a documented fact rather than a private grievance. We sent a formal cease and desist letter to Renata and Simone regarding the video, the public post in the Lake Community Group, and the group text, not because Priyanka thought we'd win a defamation suit outright, though she believed we had a real case, but because a letter from an attorney delivered by certified mail tends to focus the mind in a way that pleading phone calls never do. And this was the part that still, months later, felt like the strangest turn of the entire ordeal. Priyanka helped us quietly notify 3 of Renata's largest real estate clients' attorneys, in the driest, most factual language possible, that a formal complaint regarding an undisclosed $45,000 unsecured loan from a deceased party, alongside an unauthorized loan co-signature, was part of an active estate matter. We weren't trying to destroy her business. Priyanka was careful, more than once, to frame it as due diligence rather than revenge. But the truth was, once the facts were laid out in a straight line for people whose entire relationship with Renata was built on trusting her financial judgment, the facts did most of the work themselves. Big Diane called Marcus twice during those 6 weeks, each time more distressed than the last. Renata's facing foreclosure, Marcus. Simone's business is being investigated. A client filed some kind of complaint. Ashley's a wreck. What you're doing is destroying this family. I watched Marcus take those calls, and I watched something in him get quieter and steadier with each one, the way a fever finally breaks after days of building. He'd spent 36 years absorbing his family's chaos so it wouldn't touch anyone else. Watching him finally set that weight down, not with cruelty, but with a kind of exhausted, hard-won clarity, was one of the strangest and most moving things I've witnessed in 8 years of marriage. "Mom," he said on the second call, with me sitting beside him, my hand on his knee, "I didn't do any of this to them. Renata did this to herself, 6 months at a time for 2 years. And then she tried to use my son to cover for it. I'm not going to apologize for refusing to let that happen again." There was a long silence on the line. "So that's it," his mother said finally, her voice gone brittle. "You're choosing to end this family." "No," Marcus said, and his voice, for the first time in the whole conversation, didn't shake at all. "I'm choosing to protect the one I actually have." Word travels fast in a lake community of 380 families, and it travels faster still when the person who'd spread the first ugly story turns out to have a complicated financial history of her own. I didn't orchestrate what happened next. I want to be honest about that. Because for a long time afterward, I half expected someone to accuse me of engineering it. I didn't. I simply stopped participating in the silence. I posted once, and only once, in the Lake Community Group, the same group where Simone's edited clip had racked up over 400 views. I kept it short. I didn't name-call. I posted Cass's unedited video, in full, alongside a single paragraph explaining, plainly, what had actually happened that day. An aunt had grabbed my 6-year-old's wrist and humiliated him in front of 24 guests. I had reacted. My husband had reacted to that. And the version of events that had circulated for weeks afterward had been deliberately, carefully edited to leave out the reason any of it happened at all. I didn't mention the CPS report. I didn't mention the finances. I didn't need to. Within 48 hours, 6 people who'd actually been at the party that day added their own accounts in the comments, unprompted, confirming the timeline. Dr. Okafor wrote 3 sentences that carried more weight than anything I could have said myself, simply because he had no stake in the outcome beyond having witnessed the truth. Renata never commented. Simone deleted her account entirely. Ashley, in a move that surprised me more than almost anything else that summer, posted a short, unpolished apology of her own. Not defending herself, not explaining, just, "I was there. What happened to my nephew was wrong, and I should have said so the day it happened instead of 3 months later. I'm sorry, Wes. I'm sorry, Joe." It didn't fix anything between us, but it was the first honest thing any of them had said since the will was read, and I noticed it, and I think, on some level, it mattered. The professional fallout for Renata was swifter and colder than anything I could have wished on her, even at my angriest. 2 of the 3 clients whose attorneys we'd notified quietly moved their listings to other agencies within the month. A 3rd filed a formal complaint with the State Real Estate Board over the undisclosed loan situation, which triggered its own slow-moving investigation entirely independent of anything we'd done. By September, the agency's website no longer listed her as principal broker. By October, according to a mutual acquaintance who mentioned it to Marcus's mother, in what I have to assume was not intended as gossip, but landed as exactly that, her house, her actual house, the one she'd mortgaged twice to keep the agency afloat, was formally in foreclosure proceedings. I felt many things reading that news. Vindication, briefly. Something more complicated and less comfortable underneath it, longer lasting. I had wanted her held accountable. I had not particularly wanted to watch a woman lose her home, even a woman who had tried to help take mine, and even a woman who had used my son as leverage in a fight that was never really about him at all. Marcus, when I told him, was quiet for a long time. "I keep waiting to feel good about it," he finally said. "I don't. I just feel tired." "That's allowed," I told him. "You don't have to feel good about consequences to know they were necessary." Big Diane called one final time in late October from a blocked number, her voice frail and wavering in a way that I could no longer be entirely sure wasn't performance, though I understood by then that the performance and the genuine grief were probably tangled together in ways even she couldn't fully separate. "Caleb, Marcus," she said, catching herself. "Darling, the girls are struggling so much. Renata's losing the house. Simone's business is under investigation. Ashley's a wreck. She can barely function. What you're doing, it's killing this family. Please, can't you find it in your heart to help? Something, anything." I watched Marcus's face while he listened, the phone on speaker between us at the kitchen table, Wesley long asleep upstairs. I watched the old reflex flicker, the pediatrician's reflex, the fixer's reflex, 36 years of training telling him that his job, his only job, was to absorb pain so other people didn't have to feel it. And then I watched it settle into something else, something clearer. "Mom," he said quietly, "I will always love you. But my responsibility, my only responsibility in any of this, is to protect my son. From Renata's cruelty, from Simone's lies, from Ashley's manipulation, and from anyone who enables any of it." His voice broke, just once, on the next sentence. "That includes you." There was a long silence on the line. "I will not let any of you hurt my boy again," he went on. "Not with words, not with tricks, not with false reports to the state. If protecting him means this family is over, then it didn't end today, Mom. It ended the moment one of you decided my son was a pawn instead of a person." "Marcus, don't call this number again," he said, and he hung up. He put his head in his hands and wept, great, shuddering sobs, the kind that come from somewhere far below the part of you that makes decisions. I held him for a long time there in the kitchen, in the house his father had left him because he trusted him to hold something together, though I don't think, in the end, either of us believed anymore that Walter had meant it the way his daughters had assumed. I think now that Walter had known his son far better than he'd known his daughters. I think he'd left Marcus the house not because he trusted him to keep the family exactly as it was, but because he trusted him to figure out, eventually, what was actually worth protecting. It was the last time Marcus cried for them. It would not, I want to be honest, be the last time either of us thought about them at all. Nobody warns you that the hardest part isn't the confrontation. It's the year afterward, the slow, unglamorous work of teaching a 6-year-old that the world is safe again after he's learned in one afternoon that it might not be. Wesley didn't talk about the 4th of July much, not directly. What he did instead, for weeks afterward, was ask small, sideways questions that told me exactly how deep it had gone. "Do you have to earn food?" he asked me one night at dinner, apropos of nothing, poking at his mac and cheese. "Renata said some kids just take and take." Another time, "Am I a good kid or a bad kid?" Delivered with the flat, testing casualness of a question he'd been turning over privately for days before he trusted either of us enough to say it out loud. We found a child psychologist named Dr. Feldman, a soft-spoken man with a waiting room full of well-worn board games, and Wesley saw him every other week for the rest of that year. Dr. Feldman never used the word trauma in front of Wesley, but he used it plainly with us in our own separate sessions, and he was patient in a way that gave both Marcus and me permission to be patient too. We built small rituals. A bedtime check-in where Wesley helped Marcus test the door locks, a ceremony that had nothing to do with actual security and everything to do with giving a frightened 6-year-old a sense of control over his own safety. I showed him, more than once, the app on my phone that connected to the doorbell camera, let him watch it work, let him understand that grown-ups had systems, that he wasn't the only one keeping watch. We talked about feelings with a bluntness we'd never used before. "I feel sad about what happened with Aunt Renata," Marcus would say, sitting on the edge of Wesley's bed. "It's okay to feel sad and safe at the same time. Those aren't opposites." It felt clumsy the first dozen times. It got easier. Marcus's own transformation over that year was the thing that surprised me most. The man who had spent 36 years pleading, silently and otherwise, for family harmony now understood, really understood, in his bones, that sometimes harmony is just the silence of whoever's been asked to swallow the most. He didn't become hard. If anything, he became gentler, more present, more willing to sit in an uncomfortable feeling instead of rushing to smooth it over. But the fuzziness was gone. The guilt that had once made him excuse almost anything in the name of blood had been burned away, and what was left underneath it was something clearer and, I think, kinder. A compassion that no longer required him to abandon his own family in order to extend it to somebody else's. At the practice, his colleagues noticed, he became, if anything, better at his job, more attuned to the quiet signs of stress in his young patients' families, the things that go unsaid in a 15-minute appointment. But he also stopped being the doctor everyone dumped extra shifts on, the one who never said no to a Saturday call. He started leaving on time. He started protecting Sunday mornings, no exceptions, for pancakes with Wesley and me. His colleagues, who'd caught the tail end of the summer's drama secondhand, seemed, if anything, to respect him more for the boundaries, not less. A year is a long time, and also no time at all. By the following spring, the sharp edges of that terrible summer had begun to soften, worn down the way a shoreline gets worn down, not by one dramatic storm, but by 1,000 ordinary, gentle waves of daily life simply continuing to happen. Wesley turned 7 at a dinosaur-themed mini-golf place with 4 friends from his new school, and I watched him laugh, a full, unguarded, unburdened sound, and it felt, for the first time in almost a year, like real sunshine after a very long winter. The strangest gift the whole terrible summer left behind arrived in an inbox in early spring from a food blogger with an unreasonably large following, asking permission to feature what she called the ultimate barbecue redemption story. She'd found my maple chipotle rib recipe, the one I'd been perfecting since the spring before that 4th of July, the one that had been sitting half-cooked on a platter when the whole thing started, posted months earlier on a small recipe-sharing site I'd nearly forgotten I'd used. She had no idea about the grill, the video, the CPS report, any of it. She just liked the recipe. She wrote a glowing post about the smoky, sweet balance of it, called it the kind of ribs you make for people you actually want to impress, and linked to the tiny Etsy shop I'd quietly opened that winter, mostly as a distraction, selling spice rub blends under the name Whisper Lake Kitchen. I hadn't told her the backstory. I never did. But something about the name resonated anyway. Or maybe the recipe was just genuinely good. I'd like to believe it was at least partly that. And within a month, orders that had trickled in at a rate of maybe 3 a week turned into dozens a day. I hired my first part-time employee, a college student named Priya's younger cousin who was home for the summer, just to keep up with packing orders. By August, a regional grocery chain reached out about a small retail placement. It wasn't about the money, though the money was, frankly, wonderful, and deeply satisfying in a way that had nothing to do with anyone else's opinion of what I deserved. It was about building something that was entirely, unambiguously mine, untouched by anyone else's fingerprints, unclaimed by anyone else's narrative, mine in a way that even the beautiful house on the lake, gifted and inherited and fought over, had never quite managed to be. Marcus framed the food blogger's article and hung it in his home office, next to Wesley's kindergarten graduation photo, and I caught him looking at it sometimes with an expression I couldn't quite name. Pride, maybe, or something more specific. Relief. That something good had managed to grow directly out of the worst soil either of us had ever stood on. I ran into Big Diane in October, 11 months after the last phone call, in the produce section of a grocery store 40 minutes from either of our houses. The kind of coincidence that feels, in the moment, entirely too deliberate to actually be an accident, though I never did find out if it was. She looked smaller than I remembered. Not physically exactly, though there was some of that too, a coat that seemed to hang looser on her than it used to, but smaller in the way a person looks when the story they've been telling about themselves for decades has finally, publicly, stopped holding together. "Josephine," she said, and for the first time in the entire 8 years I'd known her, she used my actual name. Diane. I held Wesley's hand a little tighter, though he was busy examining a pineapple and hadn't noticed her yet. "He's gotten so big," she said, looking at him with an expression I couldn't quite read. Grief, maybe, for a version of grandmotherhood she'd let slip through her own fingers, one enabling phone call at a time. "I think about him, both of you, more than you probably believe." "I believe you," I said, and I meant it, which surprised me. She was quiet for a moment, turning a bag of apples over in her hands without really looking at it. "I'm not going to pretend I handled any of it well. I chose my daughter's feelings over my grandson's safety, and I told myself for months that it was because family means standing by your children no matter what. And I think," her voice caught, "I think I've had a lot of time to sit with what that actually meant, in practice. What I was actually standing by." "Renata filed a false report with the state," I said, quietly but without softening it. "She used a 6-year-old to try to win a fight about money. That's not a misunderstanding, Diane. That's not two sides of a family disagreement. That's a choice she made, more than once, on purpose." "I know." She said it simply, without the old reflexive defensiveness. "I know that now. I didn't want to know it for a long time, because knowing it meant admitting I raised a daughter capable of it, and that's a hard thing for a mother to sit with." I didn't have forgiveness for her that day, and I didn't offer any I didn't mean, but I told her, honestly, that Marcus loved her still, underneath everything, and that the door wasn't nailed shut forever. It was just closed, for now, guarded carefully, on our terms instead of anyone else's. "That's more than I probably deserve," she said. "Probably," I agreed, and for the first time in almost a year, we both, unexpectedly, almost laughed. Wesley looked up from the pineapple display right then, spotted her, and, because children are so much less complicated than the adults around them, and so much quicker to forgive what hasn't directly wounded them, said, "Hi, Grandma Diane," with the easy, uncomplicated warmth of a 7-year-old who mostly just remembered that she used to bring him butterscotch candies. Her face did something complicated and beautiful and sad all at once. "Hello, sweet boy," she managed. We didn't stay long. It wasn't a reconciliation. Not yet, not really. But it was the first conversation in almost a year that hadn't required me to defend anything, and I drove home with something loosened in my chest, that I hadn't realized had been clenched that tight for that long. Ashley, of everyone, was the one who did the actual, unglamorous work of earning her way back into something resembling a relationship with us. And she did it the only way that ever really works, which is slowly and without asking for credit along the way. She started small. A card for Wesley's birthday, no strings attached, no mention of anything else. A text on the 1-year anniversary of Walter's death, just to Marcus, saying she missed their father and hoped he was doing okay. Nothing more. She paid off the loan Renata had put in her name, a brutal, multi-year process that she never once tried to leverage into sympathy points with us. Though I know for a fact it cost her nearly everything she had. She started therapy of her own, something none of the Hartley siblings had ever, to my knowledge, done before that summer. She told me about it herself months in, sitting on our new deck with a glass of iced tea, in a conversation that felt like the first genuinely honest one we'd ever had. "I spent my whole life being the baby," she said, "the one everyone excused. I used to think that was a good deal. Get away with things, get taken care of. It took my therapist about 4 sessions to point out that it's a terrible deal, actually, because it means nobody ever expects anything real from you. And eventually, you stop expecting it from yourself either." She turned her glass in slow circles on the table. "I watched Renata grab your kid's wrist, Joe. I watched it happen. And some old, cowardly part of me went into the same mode I'd been in my whole life. Don't make waves, let the adults handle it, it's not my job to say anything. And a 7-year-old paid for that." "6, I said. "He was 6. 6, she repeated, wincing. "I know, I think about that a lot." I told her, honestly, that I appreciated the work she was doing and that it mattered and that it would take time, real time, not perform time, before I fully trusted it. She said that was fair. She kept showing up anyway, month after month, in small, consistent, undramatic ways, and eventually, almost without either of us marking the exact date it happened, she became someone Wesley genuinely looked forward to seeing. Someone who brought him actual books instead of neon soda, who asked him real questions and waited for real answers. Simone, by contrast, never reached out at all. Her wellness business folded quietly sometime that winter, following the state investigation into a client complaint that, as far as I ever learned, related to financial advice she'd given well outside her actual credentials. I heard secondhand that she'd moved to Arizona. I hope, genuinely, that she found whatever it was she'd spent years pretending to have already found. I don't know that I'll ever find out. And Renata I did not see again for a very long time. Not until the 4th of July, almost exactly 2 years later, in a moment I could not have predicted and will describe when I get to it. The idea of hosting a party again, a real one, with the good grill and the long table on the deck and more than a handful of trusted guests, was mine. And it took me most of a year to build up to suggesting it. "Are we ready?" Marcus asked, standing at the sliding door, looking out at the water the way he did sometimes when he was working something out. "To have people here again? A party here on the 4th? "It's our home," I said, sliding my hand into his. "Not a crime scene. We take it back, or we let it stay theirs forever, even after everything. I don't want to live in a house that still belongs to the worst afternoon that ever happened in it." So we built a new 4th of July, deliberately, the way you'd build anything you actually wanted to last. We invited the Davisons from down the shore, who'd quietly brought over a casserole the week after everything fell apart, without a word of gossip attached to it. Dr. Okafor and his family, Cass, up from the city with her kids, Priya and her husband, a dozen or so of the people who'd actually shown up, not with cameras, not with agendas, just with actual, unglamorous kindness during the worst months. We hung bunting along the porch rail, Marcus manned the new grill, smaller, sturdier, absurdly, almost comically well cared for, as though its unremarkable reliability were itself a kind of quiet victory. The smell of burgers and citronella and lake water slowly drove out whatever ghost scent of scorched meat and bitterness had lingered in my memory of that deck for a year. Wesley, 7.5 now, was fully in his element, showing his school friends his rock collection, daring them to dip a toe in the water under strict supervision, laughing the easy, unguarded laugh that Dr. Feldman had told us, gently, might take longer to come back than we expected. It came back that day, all at once, like something unlocking. As twilight painted the sky in long orange and purple streaks, the kids ran wild with sparklers, drawing frantic, bright circles against the dimming light. Marcus handed me a beer and pulled me back against his chest, and we stood together watching the joyful chaos on our own lawn. "He's okay," Marcus murmured into my hair, his voice thick. "We're okay," I said. "We're more than okay. We're here." He was quiet for a moment. I spent so long thinking kindness meant never saying no, never making anyone upset. That being a good son, a good brother, meant endless forgiveness, no matter the cost. He turned me gently to face him, his eyes serious in the fading light. "You taught me that real kindness doesn't require letting people poison you, that protecting the good sometimes means building an actual wall against the bad, even when the bad wears your own last name." He pressed his forehead to mine. "Thank you for being my wall, Joe." I kissed him, long, slow, tasting of beer and citronella and survival. "You built it with me," I said. "We built it together." I should say something here about where I came from because it matters, and because I've realized, looking back on that whole terrible summer, that a lot of my strength in it didn't come from anywhere brave or dramatic. It came from a much quieter, sadder place that I'd never fully explained to Marcus, even after 8 years of marriage. My own parents divorced when I was 9, badly. The kind of divorce that turns a child into a small diplomat before she's old enough to spell the word. My mother remarried when I was 12, to a man who was perfectly pleasant in public and quietly, chronically dismissive of me in private. Never cruel enough to name, never kind enough to trust. I spent my entire adolescence learning to read a room for danger before I'd even learned to read for pleasure. I learned, the hard way, exactly what it feels like to be the extra person at a family table. Tolerated rather than wanted. Expected to be grateful for scraps of attention that should have been mine by right. I never told the Hartley sisters any of this. I'm not sure it would have changed anything if I had. Renata, I think, would have found a way to weaponize even that. But it's part of why I've come to understand. I recognized what was happening to Wesley so much faster and so much more completely than Marcus did, even though it was his own family doing it. I'd lived it. I knew exactly what that particular flavor of humiliation tasted like, dressed up as a lesson about manners, delivered with a smile that never quite reached the eyes. I told Marcus all of this, finally, on the deck one night that autumn, and he held my hand across the table and said, quietly, "I wish you'd told me sooner. I would have understood so much faster why you kept flinching at things I thought were normal." "I didn't want you to think I was projecting," I admitted. "I didn't want you to think I hated your family because of my own baggage, instead of because of what they were actually doing." "Joe," he turned my hand over in his, tracing the lines of my palm the way he did when he was thinking hard about something. "You weren't projecting. You were the only adult in that house who could actually see it clearly, because you were the only one who hadn't spent 30 years being taught not to." It was, I think, one of the truest things anyone has ever said to me, and it changed something permanent in how I understood my own instincts, not as an outsider's paranoia, tolerated but never quite trusted, but as a kind of hard-won expertise, earned the worst possible way, and finally, mercifully, put to some good use. I want to be honest about something else too, because I think the version of this story that gets told at dinner parties, the slapped cheek, the flipped grill, the dramatic phone call ending a family, leaves out the much quieter, harder war that Marcus and I fought with each other during all of it, underneath the bigger one. There were nights that summer when I resented him so completely I could barely look at him, for the 11 months of small cruelties he'd excused, for every "they mean well" that had let the ground shift under our feet 1 inch at a time until an entire year had passed and I was standing in a kitchen while a caseworker asked whether my son was safe in his own home. There was one particular argument in early August, 3 weeks after the CPS visit, that I still think about. "You let this happen," I said, more sharply than I meant to, exhausted and raw. "For a year, Marcus, you watched them do it, one small thing at a time, and every single time you told me they meant well." "You think I don't know that?" His voice cracked. "You think I haven't spent every night since July replaying every single thing I let slide? I was trying to hold my family together the only way I knew how, Joe. Because it's the only way anyone ever taught me to love people who hurt me, by forgiving them faster than they could apologize." "That's not love, Marcus. That's a habit. And it almost cost us our son." We didn't resolve that fight that night. We went to bed angry, which we'd almost never done in 8 years of marriage, and I lay awake staring at the ceiling, wondering if the thing that had actually broken that summer wasn't just his family, but us. It didn't break us, but it changed us. And I think it's important to say that honestly, because the alternative, pretending a marriage sails through something like that without a scratch, does a disservice to anyone reading this who's living through their own version of it right now. We went to a marriage counselor for 4 months that fall, not because anything was wrong between us in the ordinary sense, but because we needed a neutral room to say the sharpest things out loud without it turning into another fight. What came out of it, slowly, was a version of our marriage that felt more honest than the one before it. One where Marcus no longer defaulted to smoothing things over just because conflict made him uncomfortable, and one where I no longer swallowed my instincts just because I was afraid of sounding like the difficult, untrusting outsider his family had always half suspected me of being. "I used to think being a good husband meant keeping the peace," Marcus told our counselor, in a session I still think about often. "I'm starting to understand that sometimes it means being willing to end it, on purpose, for the people who actually need protecting." I reached over and took his hand, right there in that beige little office with its box of tissues and its potted plant, and I thought, this is the man I married. It just took a war to clear away everything standing in front of him. The one relationship from that whole shattered branch of the family that survived, quietly and unexpectedly, was the one I would have predicted least. Jax, Renata's son, who was 14 the summer everything fell apart, and 16 by the time he first texted Wesley directly, out of nowhere, on a Saturday afternoon 2 years later. "Hey, is it weird if I say hi? I think about that day a lot. I was a jerk to you about the Legos. I'm sorry." Wesley, 9 by then, showed me the message with the particular solemnity of a kid who understands he's holding something fragile. "Should I write back? Do you want to?" He thought about it. "I think so. He was mean, but he was a kid too. I don't think it was really about me." Out of the mouths of 9-year-olds. He wasn't wrong. I'd learned over the 2 years since that Jax had spent that entire summer watching his mother's financial world quietly collapse around him without understanding why, absorbing her stress and her fury the way children always do, sideways, without context, and taking it out on the nearest available target, which had happened to be his younger cousin's Lego spaceship. Marcus and I let the boys text, cautiously at first, then more easily. Jax came up to the lake house once, the following summer, dropped off by Ashley, never by Renata, who I still hadn't spoken to directly since the day at the grill, and spent an entire afternoon on the dock helping Wesley identify freshwater fish from a laminated guide, patient in a way that surprised all of us. "Thanks for letting me come," he said to me, awkwardly, before Ashley picked him up. 16 years old and still visibly working out how to hold two conflicting truths at once, that his mother had done something genuinely wrong and that he loved her anyway, and that both of those things were allowed to be true at the same time. "You're always welcome here," I told him, and meant it, and understood, saying it, that some kinds of forgiveness don't require forgetting anything at all. They just require deciding that a person, especially a young one still becoming who he'll be, doesn't have to carry his mother's choices as his own permanent sentence. By the time Wesley turned 9, Whisper Lake Kitchen had outgrown my garage, then a rented storage unit, then a small commercial kitchen space I leased above a bakery in the nearest town, 20 minutes from the house. I had 4 part-time employees by then, a real logo I'd designed myself late one night at the kitchen table, and a wholesale contract with 2 regional grocery chains that still, some mornings, made me laugh out loud in disbelief when I thought about where the recipe had actually come from. A platter of ribs resting on a counter, waiting to be eaten by people who would spend the rest of that night trying to destroy us. I never advertised the backstory. I never needed to. But there was something quietly, privately satisfying about watching a business built entirely on my own hands, my own recipe, my own decisions, grow into something real and self-sustaining, entirely outside the shadow of anyone else's inheritance, anyone else's approval, anyone else's idea of what I deserved to have. Marcus came to the commercial kitchen one afternoon that spring, between shifts, and stood in the doorway watching my small team pack spice rub orders into branded boxes with an expression I'd never quite seen on him before. "What?" I asked, catching him staring. "Nothing," he shook his head, smiling. I spent 36 years being taught that the Hartley name was the thing worth protecting. The house, the money, the legacy." He gestured at the packed boxes, the hand-lettered logo, the little operation I'd built entirely out of stubbornness and good barbecue sauce. "You built something worth protecting too, Joe, and nobody handed you a dime of it." "You handed me plenty," I said. "Support, time, a kitchen with good light." "That's not the same as a will," he said, "and we both know it." He wasn't wrong. And I think that was the moment I finally understood something I'd been circling for 2 years without quite landing on it. That the whole ugly fight over Alder Cove had never really been about a house at all. Not for me. It had been about proving, to myself as much as to anyone else, that I could build something that was mine, not inherited, not gifted, not contested, not appraised by a sister-in-law running a mental calculation of square footage. Mine, in the oldest and simplest sense of the word. Priyanka called us in November, almost a year and a half after the 4th of July that changed everything, to let us know that the last loose legal thread had finally been tied off. Renata's attorney had formally withdrawn any intention of challenging Walter's will. Unsurprising, given that Priyanka had made it clear from the beginning that the challenge had never had solid legal footing. And given that Renata's own resources, by that point, had been consumed almost entirely by foreclosure proceedings and a professional reputation that hadn't recovered. We also, at Priyanka's recommendation, formalized something I'd been quietly hoping for without saying out loud. A notarized, on-record statement from Cass and Dr. Okafor and Priya describing what they'd witnessed that day. filed alongside the county's own closed CPS record, so that if anything similar were ever attempted again, another report, another edited video, another attempt to weaponize Wesley's safety in service of an old grudge, there would be an established, documented pattern for any future investigator to weigh from the very first phone call. "I hope you never need it," Priyanka said, sliding the folder across her desk to us one last time. "But I'd rather you have it and never need it than need it and not have it." I thought about that folder often in the months that followed, sitting in a fireproof box in our closet alongside our passports and Wesley's birth certificate. Not a weapon exactly, but a kind of quiet armor. Proof that the truth, when you bother to actually document it, has a way of outlasting even the most carefully edited version of events. Marcus signed the last of the paperwork with a steadier hand than he'd had the day he signed for the house itself, 18 months earlier. I noticed that. I think he noticed it too. "Funny," he said, capping the pen. "Signing my name used to feel like agreeing to hold something together. Now it feels like agreeing to protect something instead." He looked at me. "I think that's actually the better version of what Dad meant all along. I just needed 2 years and a flipped grill to figure it out." I want to spend a little time here on the parts of this story that have nothing to do with drama at all, because I think that's actually the truest measure of whether a family survives something like what we went through. Not the dramatic confrontations, but the boring, ordinary Tuesday afternoons that come after. The ones that get to just be Tuesday afternoons again. Wesley learned to water ski the summer he turned 8, off our own dock, Marcus driving the boat slow and careful, while I stood at the back cheering myself hoarse. He lost his first tooth at the kitchen table and insisted, solemnly, that the tooth fairy up at the lake house probably left better prizes than the one in the city. A theory Marcus and I were more than happy to indulge, with an extra $5 bill under his pillow. Marcus took up woodworking that winter, badly at first, filling the garage with lopsided birdhouses and one memorably crooked picture frame that still hangs, on purpose, in our front hallway, a small monument to the version of himself that was learning, slowly, how to be at peace in a house that had once been a battlefield. He built Wesley a proper treehouse the following spring, using some of the same cedar boards his father had once used to reshingle the old roof, salvaged from a stack Hollis the contractor had kept in his barn for 20 years out of pure sentiment. I planted a garden along the side of the house, nothing fancy, tomatoes and herbs and a stubborn patch of zinnias that came back bigger every year, and found, to my genuine surprise, that there is a very specific kind of peace in kneeling in dirt that belongs to you, with your hands in soil nobody can appraise, calculate, or contest. We had people over more, not less, as the years went on, not despite what had happened, but almost because of it, as though the whole ordeal had taught us something essential about who was actually worth letting into a home. The Davisons came for dinner most months. Cass and her family spent 2 full weeks with us every summer, an arrangement that had started as an act of gratitude and had turned, somewhere along the way, into something that just felt like family, the real kind, the kind that shows up with a casserole instead of a camera. Dr. Feldman, Wesley's therapist, signed off on regular sessions the spring he turned 10, not because anything had gone wrong, but because, in his words, he's just a kid now, a happy one. That's the whole goal, and you got there. I cried in the parking lot after that appointment, the good kind of crying, the kind that comes from setting down a weight you'd stop noticing you were still carrying. I said I would come back to the moment I saw Renata again, and I will, because it happened exactly where you'd expect a story like this to circle back to. On the 4th of July, almost precisely 2 years to the day after the grill went over. We were hosting again, Bigger this time. 30 guests. The good kind. The dock strung with little solar lanterns Marcus had spent a whole Saturday hanging. Wesley, now 9, and fully in charge of the sparkler distribution with a seriousness that made all the adults laugh. Ashley was there, had been for the past year and a half, a fixture now rather than a guest, currently helping me carry out a tray of the maple chipotle ribs that had, by that point, become something of a running family joke. The recipe that started a war and then, somehow, ended one too, or at least paid for the lawyer who helped end it. I saw the car before anyone else did. A dark sedan, moving slowly along the shore road that curved past our property, easy to miss except that I happened to glance up from the dessert table at exactly the right moment. It was Renata's car. I recognized it instantly, the same one from 2 years earlier, older now, a small dent in the rear bumper that hadn't been there before. It moved at a deliberate, careful pace, neither speeding up nor slowing to a stop, and for one long, suspended second, I felt every muscle in my body go rigid with an old, familiar dread. Ashley followed my gaze and went still beside me. "Joe, I see it." The car reached the point on the road directly across from our lit, crowded deck, and it seemed, for a fraction of a second, to hesitate, brake lights flickering on, just barely, just long enough that I held my breath entirely. I thought about the fireproof box in our closet. I thought about Wesley, 9 years old now, laughing somewhere behind me with a sparkler in each hand, blessedly unaware. I thought about 2 years of careful, hard-won peace, and how thin the walls of a fortress can feel in the half-second before you find out whether they're going to hold. The brake lights went dark. The car eased forward again, smooth and unhurried, and continued around the bend until its taillights disappeared into the deepening blue of early evening. It didn't stop. It didn't turn around. It just kept going. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding, and beside me, Ashley did the same. "Do you think she just wanted to see it?" Ashley asked quietly after a long moment. "The house? Us? Happy without her in it?" "I don't know," I said, and I meant it. "I don't think I need to know." We didn't talk about it again that night, not directly, but I noticed Marcus find my hand a few minutes later unprompted, his fingers lacing through mine, warm and certain, and I understood, without either of us saying anything, that he'd seen it too. "It's over, Joe," he said quietly, his eyes still on the empty road. "Some wars don't end with a treaty. They just fade. The other side gives up, or wears itself out, or finally sees that the walls aren't going to fall no matter how many times they drive past them." He looked down at me, the lantern light warm on his face. "We have the walls. We have the fort. And we have each other. That's the peace we actually won." I looked from the dark, quiet road back toward the house, where I could see Wesley through the sliding glass doors, showing his sparklers off to a cluster of kids his own age, utterly, completely unburdened. I didn't mention the car to him that night, and I never did. I didn't give the fear a name, or the past any more power over an evening that belonged entirely to the people who'd actually earned it. "Come on," I said instead, squeezing Marcus's hand, my voice steady in a way that surprised even me. "Let's go light the last of the fireworks before it gets too dark to see them." He smiled, a real smile, easy, reaching all the way to his eyes. Always. We turned our backs on the empty road and the dark water beyond it and walked back into the warm, bright noise of our own lawn, our own life, the one we had built, piece by piece, out of the wreckage of a summer that had once tried very hard to take it from us. People ask me, sometimes, friends mostly, the ones who've heard some version of this story secondhand, whether I regret the slap that started it all. Whether, looking back with 2 years of distance, I wish I'd handled that afternoon differently, found some calmer, more measured way to respond to a grown woman humiliating my 6-year-old son in front of 24 witnesses. I don't. I want to be completely honest about that, even though I understand it's not the answer that makes for the most comfortable moral of the story. I don't regret it, and I've stopped apologizing, even quietly to myself, for the fact that I don't. What I've come to understand in the 2 years since is that families like the one Marcus grew up in, the ones built on decades of quiet imbalance, of one person absorbing everyone else's dysfunction in the name of keeping the peace, don't actually break because of a slap or a flipped grill or a slammed door. They break because someone finally refuses to keep absorbing the imbalance, and the people who'd been benefiting from it, often without even fully realizing they were benefiting, experience that refusal as a kind of violence, because it cost them something they'd stopped noticing they were taking. Renata didn't lose her business because I slapped her. She lost it because she'd spent 2 years making financial decisions built on the assumption that a lake house would eventually be hers to leverage. And when it wasn't, she chose to attack a 6-year-old instead of examining that assumption. I don't carry guilt for the consequences that followed from her own choices, even the ones that were genuinely hard to watch. Even the ones that occasionally still keep me up at night, wondering if there was some gentler path I failed to find. What I do carry, gladly, permanently, is the knowledge that my son grew up understanding, at an age most kids don't have to learn it, that his safety was worth more to his parents than anyone's comfort, including our own. That is not nothing. I think, some days, it might be the whole point of everything we went through. Marcus, for his part, has told me more than once that the version of himself who exists now, clearer, steadier, still deeply kind but no longer infinitely absorbent, is a version he's grateful for, even though he'd never have chosen the path that built him. I used to think love meant never making anyone feel bad, he told me once, out on the dock, watching Wesley cast a line into water that had, by then, stopped holding any ghosts for either of us. I know now it sometimes means being willing to be the reason somebody finally feels the consequences of their own choices. That's not cruelty, Joe. I spent a long time thinking it was. It's just honesty, finally arriving on time instead of 30 years late. It was during that same spring, while Marcus was clearing out the last of his father's old tools from the back corner of the garage, tools we'd kept mostly untouched since the day we'd moved in, that we found something neither of us had known existed. A second letter, tucked into the bottom of an old metal toolbox, addressed simply to whoever finds this, in Walter's careful contractor's handwriting. It was dated 8 months before he died, well before his diagnosis, which told us it hadn't been written in the fog of a dying man's regret. It had been written by a man in full possession of his faculties, thinking clearly, planning ahead in the deliberate way he'd planned everything else in his life. Marcus read it out loud to me on the back deck, his voice unsteady from the first line. If you're reading this, I've probably already given the house to Marcus, and I want whoever finds this, him or Josephine or one of my grandkids someday, to know why. In my own words, not just the lawyers. My son has spent his whole life taking care of everyone around him, and I let him do it because it was easier for me than it should have been. I watched him absorb his sister's chaos for 30 years, and I told myself it was just his nature, a kind heart, nothing to worry about. I think now I was wrong. I think I let 3 daughters grow up believing the world owed them ease, and I let one son grow up believing he owed everyone his comfort. That's on me. A father's job is to notice these things before it's too late to fix them, and I didn't. Not soon enough. I'm leaving him the house and what's left of the trust, not because I love him more, I love all four of my children the same amount, which is to say, entirely and imperfectly, the way every parent does. I'm leaving it to him because I think, someday, someone in this family is going to need to learn how to say no. How to protect something instead of just holding it together for everyone else's comfort. I think it might as well be him, because I think underneath all that gentleness, he actually has it in him. He just needs a reason big enough to find it. I hope I'm wrong about all of this. I hope my girls surprise me. But if I'm not wrong, and if this letter is ever found, I want whoever reads it to know. It was never about the money, or the house, or who deserved what. It was about which one of my children I trusted to finally draw a line when a line needed drawing. I'm sorry it took my death to test that theory. I'm prouder than I can say, wherever I am, if it turned out I was right. Marcus set the letter down on the table between us, his hands shaking, and for a long moment neither of us said anything at all. He knew, Marcus finally said. He actually knew, before any of it happened. He wasn't just hoping I'd hold everyone together, he was hoping I'd finally learn not to. I think he loved you enough to bet on the harder version of you, I said, the one that hadn't happened yet. Marcus folded the letter carefully and put it in the fireproof box in our closet, alongside Priyanka's file, alongside the drawing Wesley had made for the caseworker 2 years earlier, 3 stick figures holding hands in front of a lopsided lake. 2 entirely different kinds of evidence, I realized, filed together in the same box. Proof of what had almost been taken from us, and proof of why, in the end, it never actually could be. Wesley is 12 now, taller than me by an inch, gangly in the particular way of boys who've just started the growth spurt that will eventually turn them into men. He still remembers that 4th of July, in the vague, softened way children remember things that happened when they were very young. Not the specifics of the insult, thankfully, but a general sense memory of a bad day that got better. A lesson he's absorbed more as a fact about his family's resilience than as a wound he still carries. Dad flipped a whole grill once, he told a new friend last summer at a birthday party, with the casual pride of a kid recounting a slightly outrageous but ultimately harmless family legend. Because someone was mean to me. It was actually kind of awesome. I didn't correct the framing. Some traumas, I've learned, are allowed to soften into family folklore, as long as the softening happens honestly, on the far side of real healing rather than in place of it. Whisper Lake Kitchen has its own small storefront now, in the town 20 minutes from the house. Alongside the wholesale business, a little shop with good light and a chalkboard menu where I spend 2 afternoons a week actually working the counter myself. Mostly because I like it, and partly because there's still something quietly, permanently satisfying about standing behind a register I built entirely on my own terms. Marcus is department chair at the practice now, a role he took reluctantly and has turned out to be remarkably good at. In large part, his colleagues tell me, because he's the rare administrator who actually protects his staff's boundaries instead of just talking about protecting them. Big Diane visits 3 or 4 times a year, always calling ahead now, always bringing something small and thoughtful for Wesley instead of an agenda. It isn't the relationship either of them had before Walter died. It's smaller, more careful, more honest. The kind of relationship built by 2 people who both understand exactly how close it came to not existing at all, and who've chosen deliberately to keep tending the little that's left rather than pretending it's more than it is. Ashley lives 20 minutes away still, closer to us now in every sense than she ever was to Renata or Simone. She and Wesley have an actual relationship, inside jokes, a standing Sunday afternoon fishing date that Marcus jokes he's jealous of. She never once, in 5 years, has asked us for anything again. Simone we've heard from exactly twice, a brief, stilted holiday card the first year, nothing since. Renata we've heard from never, not directly, not once, in 5 years. I think about her sometimes, more than I expected to. I hope, in whatever complicated, imperfect way a person can hope for someone who once tried to take their child's safety and use it as a bargaining chip, that she's found some version of peace. I don't know that I'll ever find out, and I've made my peace, mostly, with not needing to. A local news station ran a small feature on Whisper Lake Kitchen that spring. The kind of light, feel-good business segment they run between weather and sports. 3 minutes about a home cook turned small business owner. Filmed in my little storefront with its chalkboard menu and its good light. I almost said no when they asked. I've never loved being the center of attention, and some old, cautious part of me still flinches at the idea of our family appearing anywhere public, even in something as harmless as a local business spotlight. I said yes anyway, mostly because Wesley thought it would be extremely cool to see his mom on TV, and because 5 years of rebuilding had taught me that hiding from visibility out of old fear is its own kind of surrender. The reporter, a warm, unhurried woman named Carla, asked the standard questions. How'd you start? What's the secret to the rub? Any advice for other home cooks thinking about going commercial? And then, near the end, almost as an afterthought, she asked, any personal story behind the name? Whisper Lake Kitchen. It's got a nice ring to it. I thought about lying or deflecting, the way I'd deflected the food blogger years earlier. But something about the honest, uncomplicated warmth of the segment made me want to tell at least a partial truth. We went through a hard couple of years, a while back, I said. Family stuff, the kind most people go through in one way or another. This business grew out of the other side of that. I think that's true for a lot of small businesses, honestly. They're not really about the product. They're about someone deciding to build something entirely theirs after a period where it didn't feel like much of anything was. Carla didn't push further, and the segment aired that Thursday. 3 warm, unremarkable minutes that made Wesley insist on watching it 4 times in a row and made Marcus tear up a little, quietly, on the couch beside me, for reasons I understood without either of us needing to say them out loud. I got an email 2 days later, from an address I didn't recognize. Subject line, blank. I almost deleted it as spam. I'm glad, in the end, that I opened it. I saw the segment. I don't expect a reply, and I'm not asking for one. I just wanted you to know I watched it, and I'm glad. I'm glad the house has good things happening in it now. I'm glad he has a mom who fights for him. I think about that day more than you'd probably believe, and I don't say that expecting forgiveness, because I don't think I've earned any. I just wanted it said once by me, instead of by anyone else. It wasn't signed. I didn't need it to be. I recognized the careful, clipped rhythm of the sentences from 36 years' worth of holiday cards I'd once received under a different name entirely, back before any of us knew what that name would eventually cost. I never wrote back. I've thought about it more than a few times since, turning the decision over the way you'd turn a stone in your palm, checking it from every angle before deciding, again, to set it back down. Some doors, I've come to believe, are allowed to stay closed even after the person on the other side has changed. Forgiveness and safety aren't always the same transaction, and I've stopped feeling guilty for choosing safety first. I did tell Marcus about the email. He read it twice, in silence, and then folded the printed page and put it in the fireproof box, alongside everything else. Not as evidence anymore, I think, but as a kind of quiet, complicated punctuation mark on a chapter that had, at long last, actually finished closing. If you've read this far, there's a decent chance some piece of it landed somewhere familiar. A family member who tests your child's boundaries and calls it hard love. A spouse who excuses generations of small cruelty as, they just mean well. A pile of little humiliations that never quite add up to a single dramatic incident you could point to and say, there, that's the problem. Until suddenly, one day, they do. Here is what I wish someone had told me at the very beginning, back when Renata first opened her own cheap wine over the top of mine, and I told myself it was nothing, just a personality quirk, nothing worth a fight over. The small things are never actually small. They're just early. A person who grabs your child's wrist hard enough to leave a mark and calls it manners is showing you, in miniature, exactly what she's capable of at scale if the stakes ever get high enough to make it worth her while. Believe the miniature version. Don't wait for the scaled-up one to believe it, because by the time it arrives, it may already be standing in your kitchen, or worse, in a caseworker's file. Here's the other thing I wish I'd understood sooner. Protecting your child from a relative's cruelty is not the same as destroying your family, no matter how insistently the cruel relative or the family members enabling her try to convince you otherwise. Ending a harmful pattern is not the same as ending love. Sometimes it's the only way love has left to prove itself real. And if you're the spouse in this story, the one like Marcus, who spent 30 years absorbing everyone else's chaos because it was easier than learning to say no, I want you to know that the version of you capable of finally drawing that line was in you the entire time. It just needed a big enough reason to come looking for it. I hope, for your sake, that reason arrives gently. It didn't, for us. It arrived over a flipped grill on a summer afternoon in front of 24 witnesses. But it arrived, and it was enough. And 5 years later, we are still here, still whole, still more ourselves than we ever managed to be while we were busy holding everyone else together. That, in the end, is the whole story. Not the slap, not the grill, not even the lake house, beautiful as it is, sitting quiet in hours under a Minnesota sky that has, by now, seen every version of us. The terrified new homeowners, the wounded family under siege, and finally, patiently, the people we became on the other side of all of it. Just a family, ordinary and hard-won, choosing itself, on purpose, every single day since. I never got to know my father-in-law as well as I wanted to. He died less than 3 years after Marcus and I got married, and in the time I did have with him, I was still learning the particular language of a family that communicated mostly in projects and jokes rather than direct sentences. But I remember enough of him, and Marcus has told me enough since, that I want to give him a proper place in this story, because I think, in the end, he understood his family better than any of the rest of us did while he was alive to prove it. Walter Hartley grew up poor in a way that modern poverty rarely resembles anymore. No heat some winters, a father who drank, a mother who worked 2 jobs and still couldn't always make rent. He built his entire life, brick by brick, board by board, out of pure, stubborn refusal to stay where he'd started. He became a contractor because it was the fastest path he could see to owning something real, something nobody could take back from him the way things had always been taken from his own childhood. He married Diane young, had 4 kids in 6 years, and threw himself into providing for them with the single-minded intensity of a man terrified of ever going back to where he'd come from. Marcus told me once, on the dock, that his father used to say the same thing every single Christmas morning, standing in the doorway watching his kids tear through wrapping paper. "Nobody in this house will ever go without, not while I'm breathing." It was a beautiful promise, and Walter kept it, materially, for 30 years. What he didn't do, Marcus came to believe later, was teach his children the difference between never going without and never being told no. He gave them abundance without boundaries, generosity without accountability. And by the time his daughters were grown, they had absorbed a lesson their father never meant to teach them: that love and money were the same substance, that being provided for was the same thing as being disciplined, and that any withdrawal of either one, attention, cash, approval, was a kind of betrayal rather than a natural, healthy limit. Marcus, as the only son, the eldest, had been handed a different lesson almost from birth: that he was the responsible one, the one who didn't need managing, the one who could be trusted to hold steady while everyone around him wobbled. It was, in its own way, just as damaging as his sister's lesson, only it dressed itself up as a compliment instead of an indulgence. Walter watched all of this happen, slowly, over 3 decades, and I have to believe, reading that second letter we found in the garage, that some clear-eyed part of him understood, near the end, exactly what he'd built and exactly what it would eventually cost. I think that's why he wrote what he wrote, not because he loved Marcus more, because he was, in the end, trying to fix with his death what he hadn't managed to fix while he was alive. The exact moment when someone in his family would finally need to learn how to say no and mean it and hold the line, even when the people testing it were people he loved. I wish I'd known him longer. I think he would have liked what Marcus became, on the other side of everything. I think, in his own complicated, imperfect way, he'd already been betting on it, quietly, for years before any of us understood the stakes of that bet. I want to go back one more time to that first afternoon, the key turning in the lock, the sunlight on the lake, Wesley's small voice whispering that the whole lake was in our backyard. Because I think, looking back now with 5 years of distance, I finally understand what that afternoon actually was. At the time, I thought it was the beginning of our happiness. I thought the hard part, the years of Marcus's residency, the cramped apartment, my freelance work spread across our kitchen table at midnight, was over, and that everything after the lock clicking shut behind us would simply be the reward for all of it. I understand now that it wasn't the reward. It was the opening move. The house wasn't a finish line. It was a test neither of us knew we were taking, one that would eventually ask us both the hardest questions either of us had ever had to answer about who we actually were, underneath the comfortable, undisturbed versions of ourselves we'd been for the 8 years before we owned anything worth fighting over. I don't regret a single hour of the fight that followed, even the very worst of it. Even the CPS caseworker standing in my kitchen, even the video, even the 11 months of small cruelties that came before any of it broke into the open. I don't regret it because I understand, now, that we couldn't have gotten to the family we have today, steady, honest, fiercely protective of what actually matters, without going through every ugly mile of the family we almost became instead. One that smiled through humiliation, called cruelty hard love, and mistook silence for peace. The house itself, physically, hasn't changed much in 5 years. The quartz island is the same. The slate floors are the same, cool and solid underfoot, exactly as they were the first day I stood on them and let myself believe for one whole, undisturbed afternoon that we had earned an uncomplicated happiness. We hadn't, not yet, but we earned it eventually, the hard way, the only way that actually sticks. Not by avoiding the fight, but by finally being willing to have it, on behalf of the one person in the house too small to have it himself. Wesley is asleep upstairs as I finish writing this, 12 years old, exhausted from an entire day spent building something enormous and complicated out of driftwood down by the shore with 2 friends from school. Marcus is in the kitchen, humming along badly to something on the radio while he cleans up the dinner dishes, the particular off-key hum he only does when he's genuinely, uncomplicatedly content. Outside, the lake is doing what it always does at this hour, going still, holding a rough mirror of the porch lights and the first few stars, indifferent, the way it's been indifferent to every version of our family that stood on this shore since Walter first bought the land in 1994. It doesn't remember the grill going over. It doesn't remember the sedan slowing at the bend in the road. It doesn't remember the caseworker's careful questions or Renata's hand closing around a 6-year-old's wrist, or any of the 11 months of small, deliberate cruelties that came before any of it. The lake just holds whatever's put in front of it night after night and lets it go by morning. I think that's the last thing I want to say about all of this. Not that the pain wasn't real. It was. Every ugly hour of it. And I'd never pretend otherwise to anyone reading this who's in the middle of their own version right now. But pain, even the worst of it, doesn't get the final say over a place, or a family, or a life. Only what you choose to build afterward gets that. We built a home. Not the version Walter's letter imagined exactly. Not perfect harmony, not everyone gathered peacefully under one roof the way he'd once hoped. Something smaller, and I think, in the end, sturdier. A family built entirely on people who show up honestly, who tell the truth even when it costs them, who protect the smallest and most vulnerable person in the room before they protect anyone's comfort, including their own. That's the whole inheritance, as far as I'm concerned. Not the house, not the trust fund, not even the name on the deed. Just the knowledge, hard-won and permanent, of exactly what we're willing to fight for, and exactly what we're finally, mercifully, willing to let go. The porch light clicks off behind me as Marcus finishes the dishes. Somewhere upstairs, Wesley turns over in his sleep. Safe, unafraid, 12 years old and utterly unaware of how close he once came to growing up any other way. I close my laptop and I go inside, into the warm, ordinary light of the only inheritance that ever actually mattered. I mentioned earlier that Simone offered, in the days after the group text went out, to arrange a restorative circle with a mediator she knew, a soft, therapeutic-sounding proposal that I dismissed at the time as one more layer of performance. I want to go back to that offer now because I think the way we handled it says something important that I skipped over too quickly the first time. We did, eventually, agree to a single mediated conversation in September at Priyanka's insistence rather than Simone's, not the restorative circle Simone had proposed, softly lit and centered on everyone's feelings in equal measure, but a structured, professional mediation session with an actual licensed family mediator, paid for jointly, with clear ground rules set in advance. No recording devices, no surprise attendees, a neutral location, an agenda focused specifically on what, if anything, could realistically be repaired. Renata didn't come. She sent a message through her attorney declining to participate, given the current legal posture of the matter, which told us plainly enough that whatever she'd hoped to gain from continued contact, she'd apparently decided it wasn't worth the structure and accountability an actual mediator would have required. Simone came, and it did not go the way she seemed to expect. The mediator, a calm, unflappable woman named Nadia, asked each of us in turn to describe, factually, without characterization, what had happened at the party. When it was Simone's turn, she began with, "The energy that day was just so heavy, honestly, and I think we were all—" "I'm going to stop you there," Nadia said, gently but firmly. "Can you describe, specifically, what you observed happen between Renata and Wesley?" Simone couldn't. not without retreating into vague, feeling-based language that dissolved the moment anyone asked her to pin it to an actual fact. It was, in its own small way, one of the more clarifying 90 minutes of that entire summer, watching, in real time, how much of the family's usual dynamic depended on nobody ever being asked to simply describe what had actually happened, in order, without the softening. Ashley, notably, was the only one in that room who answered every question directly, including the ones that made her visibly uncomfortable. It was, I think now, the real beginning of the different path she chose in the years that followed. Not the tearful group text apology she posted later, but that quieter, harder hour of just telling the truth, plainly, in front of a stranger whose entire job was to notice when someone wasn't. The mediation didn't repair anything with Simone. It didn't need to in the end. She drifted out of contact entirely within a few months anyway. But it did something else, something I hadn't expected going in. It gave Marcus a kind of permission he'd never quite had before. To hear his family's usual language, the vague, feeling forward, blame-softening way they'd always talked about hard things, get gently, professionally dismantled in real time by someone with no stake in protecting it. I've been having that same conversation with them my whole life, he told me afterward in the car. I just never had anyone in the room whose only job was to ask them to be specific. It's incredible how much of it falls apart the second somebody does. I want to describe one more ordinary afternoon before I close this out, because I think it captures, better than any single dramatic turn, exactly what we were actually fighting for that whole summer. Wesley's 8th birthday fell on a Saturday in late September, a little over a year after the 4th of July that started everything, and we held it at the lake house. His choice, decisively, when I'd offered him the dinosaur mini-golf place again or a party at home. "I want it here," he said without hesitation. "This is my favorite place in the whole world." I remember standing in the kitchen that morning, frosting a cake shaped like a fishing boat, and catching sight of Marcus out on the dock, testing the water level markers he'd installed for Wesley's new water skiing hobby, whistling something tuneless and content, and feeling a wave of something so close to pure, uncomplicated happiness that it actually startled me. The specific, hard-won kind of happiness that only means anything because you know exactly how easily, how completely, it could have been taken from you. 8 kids came, plus parents, plus the Davisons, plus Ashley, who arrived with an actual thoughtful gift, a beginner's tackle box, carefully chosen, no strings attached, and stayed the whole afternoon, patient and present in a way that would have seemed impossible to imagine, exactly 1 year earlier, watching her weep performatively on Marcus's shoulder in the wreckage of an overturned grill. Wesley blew out 8 candles on a cake shaped like a fishing boat, made a wish he refused to share with anyone, and spent the rest of the afternoon teaching his friends how to skip stones off the dock his grandfather had rebuilt board by board. A lesson passed down now 3 generations deep, entirely intact, entirely undiminished by anything that had tried, the year before, to take it from him. I watched him from the kitchen window, flushed and laughing, utterly secure in a way that had taken every single ugly hour of the previous year to earn. And I understood, watching him, exactly why we'd fought as hard as we had. Not for the house, not even, really, for ourselves. For that. One ordinary, sunlit Saturday afternoon. A boy who trusted the ground under his feet completely, and a lake that had finally, mercifully, stopped holding anything but good memories. I've thought a great deal in the years since about whether I should end this story without ever telling you what actually happened to Renata after the foreclosure, the collapsed agency, the silence. I've decided to tell you the small amount I know. Not because it resolves anything neatly, it doesn't, but because I think stories like this one owe their readers honesty over tidiness. And the honest truth is that some people never get a clean redemption arc, and life simply keeps moving around them anyway. I learned secondhand through Ashley that Renata moved into a rented condo about 40 minutes from her old house sometime in year 3. That she took a job, an actual salaried job, not her own agency, at a mid-sized brokerage, starting over near the bottom of a career she'd once run at the top of. That she and Jax's father, long divorced by then, worked out a custody arrangement that gave Jax more stability than he'd had in years. In part, Ashley told me carefully, because Renata herself had asked for it, recognizing, apparently on her own, that the previous few years hadn't been good for him either. I don't know if she's changed in any of the ways that would actually matter if our paths crossed again. I don't know if she thinks about that 4th of July the way I still sometimes do, or whether she's built some other story in her own head where she was the one who was wronged. I suspect, honestly, that some version of that second story is the one she tells herself. Because I've come to understand that very few people are capable of holding the full, unflattering truth of their own worst choices without flinching away from it eventually. It doesn't matter to me anymore, not in any way that changes how we live. Our door stayed closed to her, and I expect it will stay closed for good. Not out of ongoing anger, but out of a simple, settled clarity about what actually keeps my son safe. Some relationships don't require an ending scene, a final confrontation, a satisfying moment of reckoning delivered directly to the person who earned it. Some of them just quietly stop, and you let them. And you spend your remaining energy on the people who are actually still standing in the room with you. That, more than any dramatic reveal, is probably the truest lesson buried in this whole story. That protecting your family sometimes means living the rest of your life without a tidy final scene involving the people who hurt you. It means being at peace with an open door you've chosen to leave closed, indefinitely, without needing anyone on the other side of it to understand why. I made that peace somewhere around year 3, sitting on the dock one quiet evening while Marcus grilled and Wesley did homework at the kitchen table behind me, and I haven't needed to revisit it since. If you've made it all the way to the end of this story, I suspect you didn't come here purely for entertainment. Family stories like this one circulate for a reason, because so many people recognize some fragment of themselves in them. Some sister who tests boundaries and calls it love. Some spouse who spent a lifetime absorbing chaos to keep an uneasy peace. Some quiet, accumulating dread that everyone around you insists is nothing, until, one day, it very obviously isn't. I want to leave you with the one thing I wish someone had told me clearly at the very beginning. Back when Renata first opened her own cheap wine over the top of mine, and I decided, for the sake of peace, to let it go. You are allowed to protect your child, or yourself, or your marriage, without needing anyone else's permission to call it protection instead of drama. You are allowed to document the small things long before you're sure they'll ever matter, because the version of you sitting quietly at a kitchen table, building a folder at midnight, is doing something wiser than she probably feels like she's doing. And you are allowed, when the moment finally arrives, and for some of you reading this, it may already have arrived, or may be arriving soon, to choose the smaller, harder, truer family over the larger, easier, more damaging one, without spending the rest of your life apologizing for the choice. We built something real on the other side of the worst summer of our lives. It didn't happen because we were braver than anyone else, or smarter, or luckier. though I'll admit some luck was involved. A friend who happened to catch 31 unedited seconds on her phone. A caseworker who did her job with genuine care. A lawyer who believed us before she even fully knew us. It happened because eventually both of us stopped mistaking silence for peace and started building the real thing instead. One honest, unglamorous, deliberately chosen day at a time. The lake is still there, holding its quiet mirror of the stars every night, indifferent to all of it, exactly as it's always been. But the house above it is ours now, in every sense that actually matters. Not because of a will, or a deed, or a letter found in a garage, but because we fought for it, honestly. And then, harder still, we stayed to build something worth having fought for. That's the whole story. Thank you for reading it all the way to the end. People ask me often enough now for the actual maple chipotle rib recipe that started all of this, that I want to close with it properly, the way I never quite managed to in any interview or blog feature. Not the exact measurements, which live behind the storefront counter and in a few thousand mailed spice tins, but the spirit of the thing. Because I think it says something true about the whole 5 years. The recipe isn't complicated. It never was. A dry rub built on brown sugar and smoked paprika, and just enough chipotle powder to make you notice it without overwhelming anything else. A low, slow cook that asks for patience rather than skill. And a maple glaze brushed on only in the final 15 minutes, so it caramelizes instead of burning. Nothing about it requires an expensive kitchen, or a lake view, or a name on any deed. It requires time and attention and a willingness to let something develop slowly instead of rushing it onto a plate before it's ready. I think, if I'm honest, that's the real recipe this whole story has been building toward the entire time. Not the ribs. The patience underneath them. The same patience it took to document a folder full of screenshots instead of reacting in the moment. The same patience it took Marcus to unlearn 36 years of conflict avoidance, one honest conversation at a time. The same patience it took all three of us together to turn a house that had briefly become a battlefield back into the thing it was always supposed to be. Some things are worth rushing. A slap across a table, a grill flipped over in righteous fury, a cease and desist letter sent the moment the facts are gathered. But most of what actually matters, I've come to believe, takes the slow, unglamorous kind of care nobody films for a highlight reel. Showing up honestly, day after day, long after the dramatic part of the story is over, until what's left standing is something sturdy enough to actually last. That's what we built out on Whisper Lake, out of the wreckage of one terrible afternoon. Not a perfect family, not an easy one, just a true one. Slow cooked, glazed only at the very end, exactly the way it was always meant to be.